Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another podcast here with Paideia today. I am joined, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and today we are speaking once again about Dante's Inferno. And I believe, Scott, that we're going to situate ourselves today literally through cartography and by looking at maps. For those of you who are listening to podcasts, of course, you won't be actually able to see these maps, but they are on Dr. Masson's YouTube page, and we will describe them in as much detail as possible. But Dr. Masson, would you kindly take us into the cosmology in which Dante situates hell, purgatory, and paradise?
So what the purpose of this is, of exploring the cartography, is trying to demonstrate something that is really essential to Dante and our understanding of the whole medieval world picture, and really the terrifically integrated. I mean, in Christian higher education these days, we talk about integration, by which we mean the integration of faith and learning. But it is the case that that's often just a slogan. And quite frankly, for those of us living in this late time, we don't live in a world of integration at all, because people's intellect and their faith are not. They're compartmentalized in many ways, and the disciplines of the academy are compartmentalized and very specialized. But that's not the case in Dante or in the medieval period. This is very much of what is so-called medieval synthesis. And so what I have on the screen here is a picture of the whole of the geography, as it were, of the Divine Comedy. And at the bottom on the screen here is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the place upon which Satan is purported to have fallen. So in Scripture, when Satan falls from the presence of God and hits the earth, there's a earthquake, of course, which is caused by that. And that is the point at which hell comes into being. The earth that was displaced by Satan in his fall is then pushed up through the earth here into what then pops up on the other side, Mount Purgatory. Now, in the middle of this, there's the hemisphere of the earth is on this side, the side in which we live. But on the other side of the equator, they thought was a hemisphere of water. And in the midst of that hemisphere of water then, or at the other end of it, Mount Purgatory arises. And at the top of that, Mount Purgatory, there is an earthly paradise. So this was opposite in many ways. And really, this has to be understood more as an idea, rather than them actually believing that this was a physical description of things, although there's some sense that that's the case.
We have to remember that the medieval mind, and to quite a large extent even the Renaissance mind, was vastly more figurative than our rather factual, and they would probably see this as relatively limited imaginings of the world that we have today, or in the modern
They would
period.
say, actually, it would be worse than that. This would be absolute barbarism. For people to trust their senses as a basis for wisdom is the sign of almost inhuman thinking.
Yeah, there's something almost animalistic, or as Dante might think of it, Epicurean, about this way of conceiving of one's world. They thought of everything in not everything, but most things in speculative terms. So they would very seldom assert something significant about their cosmology in terms of a fact. They knew that what they knew of the world was a guess. And you couldn't avoid guessing. You had to make guesses about your world in order to survive and function in your world. But it still came down to a guess. It was still speculative. I think my best understanding of reality on point X, Y, or Z is this. Does anybody else have anything to say which is going to modify that or change that or overturn that? And this is one of the big shifts from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, where during the Renaissance, all of a sudden, people begin making hard empirical statements about the reality, and the cosmos. So when Copernicus and people like this are stating things about the cosmos, they're doing so as their best guess. This is to harken back to an earlier podcast, this is a very Augustinian way of thinking. When Galileo comes along and says similar things, he's stating them as a fact. And all of a sudden, this is beginning to outrage people. How dare you? Who has access to absolute unlimited empirical truth?
That's exactly what Cardinal Bellarmine said to him, actually. It's one
Yes.
thing to present this as a theory. In fact, that is the way in which knowledge works. But to present it as an indubitable fact, as a brute fact, as it were, is an anti-intellectual endeavor of the first order. And yet, at the same time, he could take his telescope, you could view what he was demonstrating through the telescope, and it was incontrovertible. And this was seriously problematic because of its anti-intellectualism. It wasn't the fact that it was a challenge to the theory. The medievals were infinitely willing to have their theories challenged, amended, improved upon, but it was another thing to strike at the very heart of the whole endeavor.
Yeah, when you and I get to the Romantics, we're going to have a much more detailed discussion, no doubt, about the nature of what is called the phenomenological and the noumenal and the relationship of these things, and how Hegel complicates understandings of the world and whatnot. So we're not going to get into that today.
No.
But
So
it
let
is
me get back
relevant.
to this, Bill.
Yes,
Let me
please.
get back to this. So at the top of Mount Purgatory, then, is the earthly paradise. So we have the Inferno as the first of the canticles, the Purgatorio as the second, and then we move into the subject matter of the third, which is the Paradiso. And in the third, he then moves through the Ptolemaic cosmology, up through the planets, from the moon to Mercury to Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and into the Prima Mobile, and then finally into paradise itself, and in the Empyrean, which I can show here. So as you see here on this map, this is the Caelum Imperium Habitaculum Dei et Omnium Electorum, the kingdom, the habitation of God and all the elect. It's on the outermost circle of this. So here's the earth, and here are the planets, and as he goes up, he also goes in towards the heavenly city, which is depicted up here. So there's an earthly city down here, Jerusalem, and then there's the heavenly city. Note that the earthly city is as far from the heavenly city as could be because of the fall.
Right.
And the imagination of the medieval works on so many different levels. We could talk about the fourfold allegory as well, but I think that might be taking us a little off topic here for the moment, or it might make things unnecessarily complex.
Let me just throw one brief thing in about allegory, if I haven't defined it before. And I take my definition largely from the Venerable Bede, which is this notion that an allegory is simply a narrative or a description with a sustained semantic reference to another description or narrative. That's it. I mean, if you want a quick and dirty definition of allegory, that's it. What is really key here in that definition is the notion of sustained. So that this takes it beyond the realm of a symbol, and now all of a sudden you have the bits and pieces moving in terms of causality of the narrative or the description. So one thing leads figuratively to another thing, which leads figuratively to another thing, and it's infinitely more complex. The point, or the important point to take away from this, is that the medieval imagination was enormously figurative. So do they believe that this is actually the model of the cosmos in some sort of physical, empirical sense? Many of them would not. Most of them probably would not. Nevertheless, this is a tool for thinking about the cosmos and where you fit into it spiritually, ethically, morally, civically, and so on. So if you, as a modern, came to them today and said, this is ridiculous to think that this is what the cosmos actually looks like in hard empirical fact, they would just grin at you like you hadn't really understood what they were talking about. They would say, no, this is a figurative model. A few of them might maintain that it's an actual model, but the overwhelming majority would say, no, it's a figurative model. It's a tool for thinking about where we are situated. So there's no actuality to it.
Having said that, this is the Jerusalem at the bottom of the picture. I'll show you a panorama of Jerusalem here, which has at the center of this is the famous Dome of the Rock in the center of this. This is now a mosque in the center of the city of Jerusalem, the old city walls surrounding it. And over here is the Wailing Wall, which was the part of the second temple. And the Dome of the Rock itself, let me go to a close-up here. You can see it's beautiful, so inlaid with gold. But what's inside the Dome of the Rock, which is so interesting. So it's called the Dome of the Rock because of the rock which is inside the dome. And that rock was, as far as I understand it, the rock upon which, now whether this is a legend or fact, who knows, but this is where Abraham brought his son Isaac to sacrifice him. and then found, of course, that God provided a ram instead of his son. But this is the rock at the center of the dome of the rock. And this rock, according to legend, once again, is thought to have been something like a cork as a stopper on the mouth of hell.
Mm. This ties interestingly also into what we were talking about in the Old English Andreas, where the church is built over the abyss, where the crack had opened and people had been swallowed down into the depths of the earth, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if there's a connection there, but it's an interesting concatenation of ideas.
I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
There you are.
Right?
Correct.
So the cosmology here is key to understanding the progression of the poem. And again, the poem is in 100 cantos, and it moves very systematically through what is clearly, as you say, an allegorical understanding of all things. But it's very intricate, it's very laid out, and here it's been presented in the form of a map. And the cosmology here of Paradiso there. Now, this we showed this last time, this picture inside the cathedral at Florence, the Santa Maria, of Dante himself pointing to the three canticles that he will write, the Inferno here on the left, the Purgatorio behind him, and the earthly paradise at the top, and then finally the city itself, which is the picture of the heavenly Jerusalem. But of course, for him, this is actually Florence. It's not Jerusalem, the place that I showed to you earlier where the Dome of the Rock is. It's the city where Dante lives. So this is the outside of it, and as you can see, it's just like there. It's the Dome of the Rock, or rather the Florence Cathedral Duomo. And so then he points to this, and then let's now finally get to the Inferno. And so one final image of that. This is what the Inferno roughly maps out to be like. So it begins with the first vestibule where the indifferent are lodged, and then we see various rivers that divide up the Inferno. So Acheron being the first river mentioned by Virgil, and then a little later on, the walls of Dis and various other rivers that flow through this, and the Cocytus at the bottom, and I'll forget about all that. There are 9 circles to hell, and within the circles there are bulges, there are compartments where different people are lodged in accordance with the sins that they committed. And these sins are further categorized in terms of 3 sins of incontinence, sins of violence, and sins of fraud.
Scott, do you know where the notion of the 9 circles comes from?
Whoa, I do not.
No, I don't either. I'm just saying this because in Norse conceptions of hell, which is, by the way, where we get our word from. Hell is a Scandinavian term. There are also 9 circles. And so I wonder if at some level there's a sort of an anachronistic connection by the pagan Vikings to Christian cosmological understandings of hell. This is just speculation on my part. I find it interesting.
I wonder if it's mentioned in Augustine's Enchiridion. I know he talks about the importances of the numbers 7 and 8, but I can't recall what he says about 9, but I suspect it might be related to that. So 7 is the number of earthly completion, and 8 is a blessed number. Maybe 9 is a diabolic number. I don't know. But I'm now totally speculating. I'm not sure what the answer is here.
Yeah, no, this is just us.
But I am sure that that there is an answer. There's a rationale for it. That I do know, because everything here is based on an authority. Dante is not making this up, as it were. In a sense, he is, in the sense that he's pulling it all together and he's relating it and presenting it poetically, but he is appealing to authorities here to construct this. So in this sense, Dante is doing for poetry what Aquinas does for theology.
Yeah, this is, again, a really important sort of notion here to understand about the medieval mindset and Dante. Dante, like a lot of medieval thinkers, is trying to be as humble as he can. And one of the ways in which that takes shape is him depending upon the authorities who have written authoritatively in times gone by, and the texts that have survived down to him. These are known as the auctores in Latin. And medievals held these people in high respect. Those who had gone before spoke more authoritatively than those who speak in the present age. And this is one of the reasons why when you read Dante, it is absolutely necessary to have a really learned set of footnotes at the bottom of each page, because
Agreed.
the sheer complexity of Dante's references and the way in which he draws upon previous thinkers, whether it be Aquinas or Aristotle or much more esoteric thinkers, it's dizzying almost when you consider how learned Dante actually had to be to make all these references. So nothing is said on the authority of the man Dante himself. It is said on the authority of other thinkers who have gone before, which is in some senses an almost antithetical worldview to what we have today, where the newest, most cutting edge, most fashionable notions about ourselves and the world in which we inhabit are the ones which hold the most attention, if not authority. I'm not sure.
Well, it's the romantic heresy of originality, right? And
correct.
The claim of originality. They both the classical age and the medieval would regard the claim of originality as preposterous and quite frankly vulgar and also foolish.
Yeah.
And if it was held by any, it would also be a sign that they were insane.
Yeah, it's. I should add another little point here when we're talking about authorities and auctores and authors and things like this here. One of the figures who really got this sort of encyclopedic mapping sort of tendency underway during the Middle Ages was an individual known as Isidore of Seville.
Yes.
Who writes the original encyclopedia. And this is one of the dominant texts of the Middle Ages. And it's not even what he says in the encyclopedia, his encyclopedia, which is authoritative. It's rather his way of approaching existence, that he would put things into categories, that he would map things out, that he would try to define things, he would connect one thing to another. This is one of the reasons that we talk about medievals as, they're one of the most systematic of all cultures that we encounter, at least in the West. Everything has to fit into a category, everything has to fit into a box, and then they think about how those boxes connect one to the other, to the other, to the other, and how these things fit together. And Isidore writes, as you might expect, an absolute vast amount on the experience of life itself. And Dante is one of the inheritors of Isidore's legacy. So this tendency here to map things out, to world build, if you will, and then continuously revise that worldview on the basis of new information that is encountered, that's coming out of already a very long history. When we see things like also with modern writers like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, both of them were given over to the same tendency. Tolkien wrote endless maps, he invented languages, but he's coming out of a tradition that he inherited from the Middle Ages themselves. And Dante is a central part of this inheritance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So maybe should we actually get to the Inferno itself then? Having spent two of our podcasts discussions just talking about the architecture
Yes.
of the Inferno and the vast complexity. I mean, I really think it's essential to grasp, insofar as when it contradicts the Whig view of history that we have made progress and that our civilization is so far advanced in understanding and in beauty and truth and goodness that we can simply ignore the past. When we read Dante, we simply have to drop that pretense. It's simply impossible to hold, to me. And I'm not a Dante scholar. To me, it's an unsupportable and ridiculous thesis. Anyway, left off last time, and maybe I can get rid of the sharing of this now.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at our ugly mugs again a little bit more closely. The first canto introduced the whole subject matter. Dante once again finding himself in the midst of a dark woods, and it's Good Friday, but it's 6 a.m. at that point in the story, and he encounters three beasts that obstruct him, prevent him from climbing a mountain that he sees in the distance, and the mountain is Mount Purgatory, and so he cannot get up Purgatory of his own efforts, but he tries to do so for an entire day. But in his despair, he meets a shadowy figure in the dark who happens to be Virgil, and Virgil's the one who's going to take him along his journey. And he says to Dante that he's been sent by a lady to guide him, and the lady turns out to be Beatrice, and she'll lead him the rest of the way, but he has been sent to meet him there.
Right. Yeah, we'll want to talk a little bit about that. We want to talk also about how this ties into, I mean, now that we've got Virgil on scene here, we'll want to talk about how exactly this is tying into Dante's understandings of epic. And I think it's important to note here that the epic that's probably influencing him most powerfully, as it was for all medievals, was not the Iliad, it was not the Odyssey, it was the Aeneid.
For sure.
This is the thing that they're constantly discussing and studying and reading, obviously in the Latin. But it's a very different, in some senses, it's dependent upon previous understandings of previous epics. But it is a new thing as well. So maybe we need to talk a little bit about that. We saw in the Aeneid that Virgil had organized hell to some extent himself.
Yes.
The hell that we encountered in the Odyssey was a chaotic place.
Yes.
It was a meaningless place. It was a place where even rational self-consciousness had been banished. The inhabitants, for the most part, did not have access to rational self-consciousnness.
Yes. If they drank blood, they could come to their senses and speak for a time, right? But otherwise, they were this shadowy,
yeah, in some senses,
shades.
Yeah, they're not even human according to the Greek mindset, because man is the speaking animal, and they can't
Correct.
speak, and they do not know themselves as selves, so they can't judge themselves, they can't assess themselves, they can't contemplate themselves. It's an extraordinarily hellish place, and Virgil steps in and he says, okay, that's really interesting. Now I'm going to put a spin on it. And he organizes hell. He begins to verbally map it out. Nothing even vaguely close to Dante, but he begins to map it out. He says, okay, this thing comes here and this thing goes there, and these people hold these positions, and there is this key thing in hell: justice. There is justice in hell.
Justice. That's correct.
And this clearly fires Dante's imagination and like a catalyst, and he explodes on these fronts. Justice. Let's explore in resplendent detail the justice of hell. And let's not only talk about the justice of hell, because Dante is a Christian, let's talk about justice and love.
Okay, let's hold that conversation, because that is the topic of Canto 3. Where that is what is inscribed on the gates of hell, those very sentiments. But in Canto 2, he begins the Commedia proper. Remember, the canticles each have 33 cantos, except for the Inferno, it has 34. So the first canto is more just like he's winding up. He's talking about where he begins. In Canto 2, it's sunset on Good Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So he's fought for the whole day to try and get up the Mount Purgatory. He can't get anywhere. And now his guide Virgil is taking him up, or rather where he needs to go. And I'll read a little bit, a few extracts from that, and I'll get to the invocation, the muse, which will mark it out as an epic, as we've known. So this is from the Sayers translation. Day was departing and the dusk drew on, loosing from labor every living thing save me and all the world. I alone, must gird me to the waves, rough traveling, and pity's sharp assault upon the heart, which memory shall record, unfaltering. Now, muses, now, high genius, do your part. And memory, faithful scrivener to the eyes, here show thy virtue, noble as thou art. I soon began poet, dear guide, 'twere wise surely to test my powers and weigh their worth ere trusting me to this great enterprise. Thou sayest the author of young Silvius's birth did to the world immortal, mortal go, clothed in the body of flesh he wore on earth, etc., etc. Now he's referring here to, he's explicitly having invoked the muse, which is a mark of every epic up to this point, and certainly of Homer, but also of Virgil himself. He will invoke the muse right at the outset of his own Aeneid. And now Dante invokes the muse, and then he immediately turns to Virgil and asks him at this point, and he invokes this, what he calls it here, the young Silvius' birth. Well, this is a reference to Virgil's fourth eclogue, in which he prophesies the coming of a figure who will be and was understood by the church to be a messianic figure. I wonder if I can find that on my screen here. You talk, Bill, and I'll see if I can find that here.
I'm not sure what I've got to say in the wake of all of that. I will say, let's talk a little bit about the poetic nature of what Dante is writing here, because we can get carried away with the ideas of Dante. Dante is very much an ideas man, but there is a sort of an aesthetic and emotional register to what he's saying as well. Better caught, no doubt, in the Italian than in our translations thereof. And what we encounter here with Dante the persona, always to be distinguished from Dante the author, because we know that oftentimes they say opposite things from one another, is that Dante is saying that a universal battle that all of us have to fight is a battle with ultimate existential despair. This is what threatens Dante the persona at the beginning. He has tried under his own powers to make it up the mountain. He's been blocked by the three beasts. I believe it's a lion, a wolf, and a leopard. And so there's no way forward. He's searching desperately for a source of hope. And it's only when he encounters the figure of Virgil, who is going to lead him down to go up, that he begins on his journey back to hope, back to peace, back to Beatrice. But you've got something for us here, Scott.
Yes, so this is from Virgil's fourth eclogue, and it was regarded by the church as prophetic in the same sort of way that Isaiah is, and it sounded very much like it. And I will just read just a few lines from it to give a sense of why they thought this was so. So he says, so muses of Sicily, essay we now a somewhat loftier task. The majestic role of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou, at the boy's birth in whom the iron shall cease, the golden race arise, befriend him, chaste Lucina, 'tis thine own Apollo reigns. And in thy consulate this glorious age, O Pollio, shall begin, and the months enter on their mighty march. Under thy guidance, whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never-ceasing fear. He shall receive the life of gods, and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, and with his Father's worth reign o'er a world at peace. For thee, O boy, first shall the earth untilled pour freely forth her childish gifts, the gadding ivy spray with foxglove and Egyptian bean flower mixed, and laughing-eyed acanthus. Of themselves untended will the she-goats then bring home their udders swollen with milk, while flocks afield shall of the monstrous lion have no fear. Thy very cradle shall pour forth for thee caressing flowers, the serpent too shall die, etc., etc. So what we have here is an undoing of the signs of the fall in the pagan conception and the original injustice, which was the rebellion of Jupiter against Saturn's reign. So we will now return to the original. The Greeks and the Romans saw history as being a cyclical thing. We'll go from the fall from the golden to the silver to the bronze to the iron age, and now we're returning to a golden age. But they saw in the reference to the child here and the life that he brings with him a reference to the Messiah that, of course, Virgil himself did not know and yet seemed to prophesy ignorantly of. And that's why he takes off here.
Yeah, it's difficult to overstate the veneration in which the Aeneid was held. There's a form of literature that is promulgated by early Christian writers, whereby it's known as a canto, whereby they would take bits and pieces of previous great works of literature and turn that to Christian usage. Juvencus does this famously, but a number of other individuals do this as well. And one of the earliest of these actually is somebody who's just essentially what we might call cutting and pasting Virgil's Aeneid to talk about Christian messages and what have you. And it turns out she's a woman, and because she's a woman, what's his name? Jerome censures her and says, "How dare you?" As Jerome basically does to everybody he encounters. But even so, it becomes a popular way of doing business. So they're continually looking back to the Aeneid, but they're doing it from a Christian perspective. By the time we encounter Dante, that has become a full, rich tradition of looking back at Virgil. Now, did Dante actually believe that Virgil was speaking prophetically in some sense? I don't know. I want to be careful about my assertions on that front. Again, is this perhaps a figurative understanding of what Virgil was trying to articulate rather than something else? Who knows? Because we know that Dante himself was of an enormously philosophical bent of mind. Nevertheless, you're right. He's invoking things here that point directly back to the authorities, and Virgil, of course, being foremost amongst them, and the eclogues, of course, being very high on his register.
Yeah. So what I have here is, again, a different image of the Dante's Inferno, and what it has here is the sphere of limbo here, right here. And limbo is the place from which Beatrice found Virgil, along with other poets. We'll meet them in Canto 4. We're here in Canto 2, but Beatrice went and spoke to Aeneas, Virgil there, and brought him to come and meet Dante. And in his dark moment, that's how she reached out to him. And now he has met him. He's going to lead him, and we'll just skip over Canto 2 here and come to Canto 3, and we'll conclude with this, Bill. But the inscription on the gates of hell, which you already referred to in the sense of the love and the justice which are met in them, which are so vital to understanding the whole poem. Because in the Dante's conception, love and justice are not contradictory; they are implicated inextricably with one another. Love and justice, the whole of the cosmology of Dante is moved by love, and at the same time, everything that happens is just and always just.
Yeah, if you miss that point about Dante and his work, you've missed pretty well everything.
Yes.
This is the beating heart, that justice and love are not only are they not contradictory, they are inextricably bound up with one another in his worldview, and you can't conceive of one without the other. We're going to see later on Milton pick up on this front and explore it in more detail, because this is what fired Milton's imagination to a large extent, and he builds an entire theodicy around this, and he really goes after the heart of this. How can a good God allow bad things happen to quote unquote good people? But here already we find the foundations being laid for that cosmology, that sort of cosmological approach to hell and its operations and everything, and purgatory and paradise that follows. But carry on, Scott. You were going to say some more about the inscription.
Well, not a great deal, just to mention that was the case. And then I was going to read the inscription on the gate of hell, which the poets themselves also read. I'll read this, and then we can comment on that further. But this is exactly what is being said. Now, remember what I said about the geography here, that hell itself came into existence when Satan fell from the heavenly courts and hit the earth and then displaced the earth, and then he got stuck right in the bottom, in the middle of the earth, as it were. And then the gate of hell was inscribed as a city and so forth. So here, it's now Good Friday at 7 p.m. chronologically, and they are at the gate of hell, and here's what the inscription says. It says, "Through me the road to the city of desolation. Through me the road to sorrows diuturnal. Through me the road among the lost creation. Justice moved my great maker. God eternal wrought me. The power and the unsearchably high wisdom and the primal love supernal. Nothing ere I was made to be, save things etern. And I etern abide. Lay down all hope, you that go in by me." Now, "abandon all hope, ye who enter" is another way of translating it in the older one that is part of the English language. But the fact that hell is a consequence of Satan's rebellion, and that there's justice even in that, I think is interesting. And of course, God himself in his nature is love. And so that's the nexus of the love and the justice being connected there. But it will also explain the various levels of hell. These are all infractions against love of a wide variety, whether it's incontinence or whether it's violence or whether it's fraud, and fraud being the worst of the three.
Mm-hmm.
These are all defects of love. Sometimes they're a lack of love, and sometimes they're an excessive love, but an excessive love towards oneself rather than being properly directed towards God and one's neighbor.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get misled in modern conversations about Dante by expressing this not in terms of love, but in terms of desires.
Yes.
And
Good.
maybe, I've mentioned this, I think, before, but it's worth mentioning again here because we're talking again about love, which is that, the Greek conceptions of love were very complex. They had various species of love or desire. But in the Christian worldview, it tended to break down into a dichotomy. And you've got cupiditas on the one hand, which is self-serving desire. And so if you're in a marriage which has been formed around cupiditas, you're simply going to try to exploit your spouse, your children, what have you, for whatever you can get out of them. And it might be material gain of some kind. It could be psychological gain. But the bottom line is they're there to serve your desires. And that's why you desire them, because they can fulfill certain needs. And Christian thinkers recoiled from this notion. By the way, cupiditas is where we get our modern word Cupid from, so I'm not sure the accolades that attach to him are particularly cheery. On the other hand, you've got the Christian conception of love, which is charitas. This
Charity.
This is the other serving love. So if you can think about somebody that you love for their sake alone, and you wish for their well-being, their spiritual well-being, their physical well-being, all these levels of well-being, it's a sacrificial or altruistic love. And a lot of parents don't need this explained to them. As soon as they think about the relationship with their children, this is what they've got for them. They will give more than they get from those children. It's a bad investment in terms of selfishness. And nevertheless, it is beautiful and wonderful and noble to love in this way your child or your spouse or whomever. So when we merely talk about desire in Dante, we can get easily sidetracked and not think at a more complex level about the kind of love that he's talking about. So when we talk about love, let's talk about love, but let's talk about love within this conception of charitas and its perversions. As you said, when you move down into hell, we find a lot of these perversions of love or desire. And we slip back into various forms of cupiditas and what have you. We're going to see that very significantly as we go deeper and deeper into hell and the nature of the sinners that we encounter there and the things that they have loved or desired, if you like.
Yes, excellent. And of course, they are rooting this as we connected love and justice. Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, and he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself.
Correct.
And the whole of the Augustinian tradition understands all sin in accordance with degrees of love and failures of love. And of course, God being love. So I got another quote here from 1 John 4, verse 10. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son to be a propitiation for our sins. So this is the caritas, the self-giving love, the non-selfish love that you discussed here. And of course, Dante is just reflecting upon this very profoundly and intricately, and that explains the whole of the Commedia and its delineations in various forms. We're going to have to finish there, Bill.
Yeah. I was going to say something more about how this all of a
we'll
sudden
say something more and let's conclude with it.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that this suddenly makes much more coherent the dynamics of grace in a Christian worldview. A lot of people have a misconception about how grace and love actually work in Dante's worldview. And there's this nonsensical notion that somehow it just doesn't make sense, this sense of sacrifice. Why would you sacrifice for somebody who doesn't deserve it? And morally, none of us deserve it, this love. We're bereft, and yet we are loved. How do you actually get at that? And caritas is one of the key sort of notions that you need to understand in order to begin to get a comprehension of how these sorts of things work. And indeed, Augustine actually said, you want to figure out whether or not you've heard a good sermon. Really easy. It's dead easy. You don't need to be a genius or an intellectual. Did the sermon effectively promote the love of God in this sense of caritas? Yes or no? Can you actually demonstrate where that is? Point to me the points at which that sermon did that job. And if it didn't do that job, you just wasted your morning. So
Yeah.
there you are.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's leave off at that point. We have so much more to talk about with Dante. So folks, thank you for joining us today. This is Paideia Today. I am, again, Dr. Friesen, and I am joined by Dr. Masson here. And we wish you all well and hope that this was illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you.